I grew up in a fundamentalist church that rejected many aspects of science because science seemed to undermine our rock-solid belief in what the Bible told us. We were biblical inerrantists, which means we believed every single word to be true. And when I left the church, I clung to the seeming certainties of science instead. The story gets a little more complicated, but one insight that struck me recently as I've committed myself to climate activism is the difference between understanding the scientific realities of changes in our climate that are driven by burning fossil fuels and choosing to do something about it, which points up the difference between knowing facts and caring enough to do something. We Unitarian Universalists are sometimes tempted to believe that all we need in life is to dig deeply into the facts and all will be clear. But unless that understanding leads us to make choices that may not be easy but are morally right, all of our knowledge will not make our lives better or more satisfying. One of my longtime friends from my first congregation at Second Parish in Hingham was a thoroughgoing scientist, and he would always come back to any spiritual ideas I propounded with, well, eventually science will tell us the answer to that. Except that, of course, we live in mystery, and the mystery will continue way past the 1,000 years of the scientist's dreams in our reading. So let me start with the story of a particular effort that I was upon to find a more subtle understanding of the relation between science and religion. Evolution Sunday started about 20 years ago when a group of religious liberals, including many Unitarian Universalist ministers, decided to have a response to local efforts by conservative Christians to prevent or undermine the teaching of the story of evolution in public schools. And the founders chose to target the Sunday closest to the birth of Charles Darwin on February 12, 1809, coincidentally, the day of birth of our own Abraham Lincoln. Their first letter proclaimed that, quote, "For far too long, strident voices in the name of Christianity have been claiming that people must choose between religion and modern science." Over 600 Unitarian Universalist ministers have signed the letter by now. Their letter reads in part, "We, the undersigned Unitarian Universalist clergy, believe that the timeless truths of the Bible and other scriptures may comfortably coexist with the discoveries of modern science. We believe that the theory of evolution is a foundational scientific truth, one that has stood up to rigorous scrutiny and upon which much of human knowledge and achievement rests. We ask that science remain science and that religion remain religion, two very different but complementary forms of truth." As Unitarian Universalists, we come from a long tradition of reason. William Ellery Channing, in the sermon that created Unitarian Christianity in 1819, said, "Say what we may, God has given us a rational nature and will call us to account for it. We may let it sleep, but we do so at our peril." Our fourth principle calls us to affirm and promote a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And among the 6 sources of our religious tradition is humanist teachings which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science and warn us against the idolatries of mind and spirit. Now, there's a misapprehension that about science that holds that it is completely factual, true in some absolute sense, but that's never the case. When I was working at the American Stock Exchange, I had a quality assurance manager who would come to me to report on the bugs that his team were finding in a program they were working on. And after his report, I would ask for his understanding. So what do we do? How do we decide whether to go forward with this release or not? And he would say, well, it's not scientific, but And I would point out to him that actually science is about collecting information, making theories and hypotheses, doing further testing to see if our hypotheses are accurate, are the number of bugs going down in this particular case, interpreting the data and deciding what to do based on something less than certainty. Our scientific knowledge is constantly expanding and changing. If you believe that science never changes and gives us absolute truth, consider the field of physics, where Newtonian physics seemed to provide for hundreds of years an absolutely truthful and accurate account of the universe. And then along came Einstein, and it turns out it was not quite true. And then quantum physics. Does anybody understand quantum physics? Yeah. So yeah, it's not Newtonian physics. It's a greater. Oh, and then there are the physics of multiverses, and yeah. So even the things that we think are absolutely most certain are subject to change, because that's the nature of science. Science is constantly gathering new data, finding contradictions, making changes. Of course, one of the jokes is that science changes when the older generation dies off and the new folks come along with new theories that they in turn prove. So what doesn't change is the method of science, a willingness to ask questions as more information gets to be available and to revise our theories as we accumulate more information and insight. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that, like all other human endeavors, science is pursued according to the resources provided to scientists and the interests of those who provide the resources. Doctors and scientists in the pay of pharmaceutical companies or oil companies or tobacco companies are rightly subject to questions about whose interests their research and findings serve. You may recall in the film An Inconvenient Truth that Al Gore quotes something by Upton Sinclair. It is difficult to get a man to understand something if his salary depends on not understanding it. So it's therefore important that public funding be provided to help ensure that scientific studies are in fact objective and in the public interest and not tainted by the special interests whom they serve. Darwin's theory of evolution, where we started, provides a framework to understand biological change over time. And like all good scientific theories, it's fruitful of new insights. It's changed over time, but it helps to guide experimentation and discovery, and it's subject to revision and change and new information, which we're constantly discovering. So if you say that Darwin's theory has been disproven because it's changed, that's science. That's how it works. So why is the theory of evolution so hotly contested? And still, and I believe our new Speaker of the House may have some thoughts about that. My own exposure to this controversy started when I noticed tracts in our church titled, "Was Your Grandmother a Monkey?" with a picture of a fairly ugly monkey looking vaguely human. Part of the point of the tract was that Darwin was an atheist and he was using science to undermine religion. Actually, Darwin was Unitarian, but I wasn't aware of that at the time. And I remember the thrill of reading Inherit the Wind. Do you remember that wonderful Broadway show, Inherit the Wind? That wonderfully iconoclastic play which fictionalizes the encounter between Clarence Darrow, the great defense attorney, and already one of my great heroes, and the fundamentalist William Jennings Bryan, the Scopes trial, Tennessee, 1925. By that time, when I was 14 or 15, I was pretty clear that I was on the side of the scientists, the good guys of the piece, and I loved the way Darrow's character cut down Bryan to size. It was personal for me because it was part of my process of distinguishing my own beliefs from those of my family, and it involved a somewhat wrenching break. And at the time, I was given to believe that either the Bible is true or the theory of evolution is true. There couldn't be any compromise between them. Bible says God created human beings. Theory of evolution says humans evolved from lower life forms. So, given a choice between the constricting religion of my childhood and the wide open possibilities of the world outside, there was no question in my mind that the religion of my childhood would have to give way. Now, biblical fundamentalists are not the only ones who hold there is a strict choice between religion and science, between the book of Genesis and the theory of evolution. Militant atheists like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens have made just as strenuous a case for a forced choice from the other side. And on occasion, they advocate the same kind of intervention in education, for example, that is done by fundamentalists. So in an article in Wired magazine, Richard Dawkins says that he believes the atheist movement ought to evangelize aggressively, including preventing parents from teaching their beliefs to their children. He says, how much do we regard children as being the property of their parents? It's one thing to say people should be free to believe whatever they like, but should they be free to impose their beliefs on their children? Is there something to be said for society stepping in? What about bringing up children to believe manifest falsehoods? Now, you quote that in a school board these days, and you will generate a rather strenuous reaction against it. And we're seeing that in other matters, particularly about gender and race right now. Who gets to decide what beliefs ought to be imposed? Now, it seems to me that this viewpoint represents the opposite extremes in which crusaders who wish to dilute or prevent the teaching of the theory of evolution in our schools points up to the overinflation of the capabilities of science in our living. The notion that everything of value can be learned from science is as absurd as the notion that everything of value can be learned from the Bible. I learned years later that William Jennings Bryan was a much more complicated character than the one portrayed in Inherit the Wind. He was representative of the interests of farmers and against the bankers and the robber barons in his 3 campaigns for the Democratic, as nominee of the Democratic Party for the presidency, starting with his Cross of Gold speech in 1896. He would fit well on the progressive left these days based on what he was fighting for back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He was Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson until 1915, when he resigned on a point of principle about the way that Wilson's handling of the sinking of the Lusitania was leading America closer to war in Europe. One of the very few cabinet officers in our country who ever resigned on a point of principle. He was a very significant, very principled, very smart person. And his biggest objection to the theory of evolution lay in its extension into social ethics in the form of social Darwinism. The notion that only the fittest ought to survive in human societies, that those who were too weak to fend for themselves deserve to be eliminated. You may hear a little bit of the kind of ideology that was adopted in Germany during the Second World War, the survival of the fittest. This illegitimate extension of Darwin's theory of natural selection in support of a heartless social policy is a prime example of the danger of assuming that science can tell us not only what is, but what ought to be. Darwin himself would not have approved of that kind of extension of the theory into social ethics. He himself said, important as the struggle for existence has been and even still is, yet as far as the highest part of man's nature is concerned, there are other agencies more important. For the moral qualities that are advanced, directly or indirectly, much more through the effects of habit, reasoning powers, instruction, religion, etc., than through natural selection. And I have to say there is an era in our own Unitarian history in which the notion of survival of the fittest led to a kind of willingness to, for example, promote sterilization of those less able, not fit for extending life. And we find this even in the movement of Margaret Sanger, who was strongly supported in the 20s and 30s by many of our co-religionists of that era. So if the social Darwinists were right to extend Darwin's theory beyond the facts of biology into the practice of human society, who would then care for the widow and the orphan, the hungry, the naked, the blind, the prisoners, the aliens seeking help in a foreign land, such as we are now seeing coming to our shores due to various crises in Central America and many other regions? And yet Jesus, prophets of Israel, the Quran, the Buddha, prophets of all religions call on us to do exactly that, because not that it's in our own self-interest or because it happens this way in the animal kingdom, but because it is right. Now, Brian was wrong to assume that this undermined the theory of evolution in biology, but he was not wrong to object to the extension of evolutionary biology into the realm of morality and religion. Of course, evolution is by no means the only issue in which the consensus of science and scientific knowledge comes into conflict with personal or political or religious beliefs. The COVID epidemic, to cite a recent example, generated reactions against vaccination and mask wearing, mostly from the right, politically. But given the close alignment between conservative and populist politics and conservative religion, there's clearly a reactionary religious component as well. One of the strongest reactions was to the closure of religious organizations and the prevention of Sunday morning worship during the worst times of the pandemic spread. And of course, opposition to vaccination is by no means confined to the right. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., now announced as a candidate for the presidency of the United States, is a fervent opponent of vaccination. This from a somewhat progressive perspective. You may recall that anti-vax sentiment resulted in an outbreak of measles around kids who were going to Disneyland a few years ago. And in this case, the opposition came about in part because an article was published in a medical journal, sounds scientific, purporting to demonstrate a link between vaccination and autism. Now, the article was actually wrong. It was withdrawn. It was repudiated by the journal, but the damage was done. Science changes as our knowledge expands and as wrong turns are corrected, and that sometimes poses an issue for people who believe that science is unchanging. We know the absolute truth, and if you ever change what science tells us, then science as a discipline must be wrong. We saw it during the early stages of the COVID pandemic. Epidemiologists studying the spread of the disease initially assumed that it was primarily propagated by large droplets falling on surfaces rather than through aerosols. So we went through a period, you may recall, when there was what we called hygienic theater, where everything was being cleaned constantly, all the surfaces were being cleaned, but we were discouraged from using masks. Now, in fact, one of the motivations, I think, was that there simply were not enough masks in the world to protect everybody, and it was much more important that they be dedicated to folks who were working in hospitals to protect them, our healthcare workers. And then further research showed that, in fact, it spread through aerosols, and we all became encouraged to wear masks, which fortunately had by that time become somewhat more available. But those are the kinds of changes that will happen as we understand the science, as we study, as we get more facts. So scientists err when, like Richard Dawkins, they extend their findings from discovery to meaning. If accepting the theory of evolution means that we have to become atheists and accept that neither this creation nor our own lives have meaning, we can understand why some will reject the theory, even though it's proven immensely fruitful in understanding our world. We don't and can't live our lives by science alone. Science doesn't give meaning and purpose to our lives. Those who oppose teaching the theory of evolution in the schools fear that if the literal creation story of Genesis is not true, then nothing in the Bible is true. They are wrong. They fail to understand that we're rarely given to receive assurance of absolute truth in either science or religion, in business or in love. We human beings always have to make choices based on insufficient data, and then we have to act based on those choices. We don't fall in love because science tells us it's right, and when we mourn, we don't turn to science for comfort. We don't commit ourselves to fighting climate change because, quote, science tells us to. We do it because of our love for generations to come and for all the beauty of the earth. These are different realms of knowledge, different magisteria, as the biologist Stephen Jay Gould put it, and allowing one to control or dominate the other is neither wise nor sensible. And we as Unitarian Universalists correctly include both mystery and wonder and the results of science in our search for truth. And we also wisely recognize that our lives are a journey toward truth and never the absolute possession of truth. General laws from the sciences cannot instruct us in the joy of living right here, right now. We find ourselves always in the middle between the ultimate unknown that is the very beginning of everything. Where do we come from? The nature of who we are, what are we? And whatever lies in the ultimate future. Where are we going? Mystery, mystery. Life is a riddle and a mystery. We are meaning-making creatures. We wish we could penetrate to the beginning of everything and explain everything, but we can't. We are the ones, each one of us, who must make the meaning of our own lives. We must commit ourselves to caring for our Mother Earth and our human future on Earth because it is right, not because science tells us so. We don't need to deny the intricacies of our descent or the reality of faith to find meaning, and above all, to make meaning. There is grandeur in our living right here in the middle. Mary Oliver's poem, another everyday poem, offers this. Every day I consider the lilies, how they are dressed, and the ravens, how they are fed, and how each of these is a miracle of Lord love and of sorrow. For the lilies in their bright dresses cannot last, but wrinkle fast and fall. And the little ravens in their windy nest rise up in such pleasure at the sight of fresh meat that makes their lives sweet. And what a puzzle it is that such brevity, the lavish clothes, the ruddy food, makes the world so full, so good. May we live in that goodness. May we give our lives to that goodness. And may we spread it everywhere our steps may take us. So may it be, and amen. Time now for our offering and offertory.
Thank you, Paul. You left us with a lot of things to think about. We have come to the time in our service where we have an opportunity to give from our abundance, to share in the ministry of the Meeting House by supporting its work in the world and acknowledging its meaning in our lives. Whatever and however you choose to give, please know that your generosity is appreciated, and now the offering will be gratefully received.
What a good peace one more time. Peace and justice.
Our closing hymn is number 343, A Fire, Mist, and a Planet. Number 343. Please rise in body or in spirit.
A fire, mist, and a planet, a crystal and a cell, a starfish and a saurian, and caves where ancients dwelt. The sense of lore and beauty, a face turned from the sod. Some call it evolution, and others call it God. Haze on the horizon, the infinite tender sky, the reap-rich tints of cornfields and wild geese sailing by, and over high and lowland, the charm of goldenrod. Some call it autumn, and others call it God. Like tides on crescent sea beach, when moon so new and thin, into our hearts our yearnings come welling, surging in. Come from the mystic ocean, whose rim of no foot has trod. Some people call it longing, and others call it God. A century lone and frozen, a mother stopped for her brood, and Socrates' dread hemlock, and Jesus on the rood, and millions who, though nameless, the straight hard pathway trod. Some call it consecration, and others call it God.
Let's join together in the words for extinguishing our chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Please be seated. Our closing words are by Wangari Maathai, who was awarded the 2004 Nobel Prize for her contribution to sustainable development, democracy, and peace. She was the first African woman to win. She founded the Greenbelt movement, which focused on the planting of trees, environmental conservation, and women's rights. This is from her Nobel Prize acceptance speech. We are called to assist the earth, to heal her wounds, and in the process, heal our own. Indeed, to embrace the whole creation in all its diversity, beauty, and wonder. Let us all find our way to do our part. Let us love our mother, the earth. Let us listen to her. Amen. Peace, love, shalom, salam, blessed be. Namaste. Abrazo a todos. Vaya con su Dios. Blessed be.
The service is ended, and you're welcome to go downstairs and have coffee, and those on Zoom can will be directed to their different groups. Thank you for coming, and